Already in the short introduction, page 5 to 10 of his book on Solon's Atlantis, The Sources of Plato's Myth, an Ugaritic tale found in Egypt, 2022, Johan S. Ellefsen provides the main outlines of this thesis. In the very first paragraph, he claims that Plato's Atlantis is a story where Greek and Egyptian myths converge, and that Plato did not invent Atlantis, at least not all of it. Ellefsen regards the story, narrated by Plato's Critias, that Solon brought the Atlantis story from Egypt to Athens as literally true, and even embellishes it, page 7s. The Egyptian tale of truth, narrated by Plato's Socrates in the Phaedrus, was part of a series of translated texts brought from Egypt that were in Plato's family since the time of Solon. Among these translated Thai texts, Plato remembered that there was an Egyptian tale that mentioned the foundation of two rival cities and a war of the Egyptian gods and the god of the sea. This myth resonated with the foundational myth of Athens, where Athena won the patronage of Athens over the god of the sea Poseidon. If he, i.e. Plato, could demonstrate that both tales were relating the same story, this Egyptian myth would put the foundation of Athens right at the beginning of the Egyptian civilization. In the chapters that follow, I will explain how Plato put together this theory and framed it as the story of a war between Athens and the kingdom of Atlantis. Both tales, relating the same story, can we simply equate the foundation of two rival cities and a war of the Egyptian gods and the god of the sea, i.e. several gods quarreling over two cities, on the one hand, and the foundational myth of Athens, where Athena won the patronage of Athens over the god of the sea Poseidon, i.e. two gods quarreling over one city on the other? Soon afterwards, Ellefsen promises some truly extraordinary things. p8. This book uncovers the sources of Plato's Atlantis. The trail of evidence will lead us to a 3,000-year-old Egyptian papyrus recounting a story brought from Syria, as well as some obscure Greek traditions preserved in the midst of the Arcadian mountains. Plato aimed at rebutting the accusations of plagiarism leveled against him by arguing that the Egyptians borrowed from Athens its ancient laws. The last sentence of this quote contains a claim that is quite incorrect. Plato, or his speaker Critias, nowhere claims that the Egyptians borrowed from Athens its ancient laws. Rather, the Egyptian priests that are quoted in this tale repeatedly stress that the goddess Athena herself was responsible for establishing political institutions both at Athens and, 1,000 years later, at Egyptian Sires, Tim, 23rd century, 24th century. Because of this time gap, too, it is also wrong to speak of a 9,000-year-old Egyptian account, P09. And an even more egregious mistake follows immediately, page 9sc. He also placed the events of the Atlantis invasion within the context of Greek mythology, in the times of Cecrops, the first king of Athens, and the kings that preceded Theseus, the unifier of Attica. This refers to an admittedly difficult sentence in Critias 110 AB, but which nevertheless states something clearly different. Of Cecrops and Erechtheus and Erichthonius and Erysichthon, and of the others, most of the names, as many as are handed down regarding the individual predecessors of Theseus, of these names, the priests, according to Solon, are said to have attributed the greatest part to those ancient Athenians, and thus describe the war of that time. Third, despite the difficulties of the text, this is a quite clear statement that the Athenian leaders in the war against the Atlanteans had the names of the much later, living, mythical kings of Athens, but were not identical with them. These names are, according to Plato's Critias, in fact the only remnants from the tale of the great Athenian war against Atlantis that were preserved in indigenous Athenian tradition. Thus, already Ellefsen's introduction contains a number of significant mistakes. In the first part of the book, Fact or Fiction, page 11 to 18, Ellefsen compares the Atlantis story both to the Bible and to the myth of the Trojan War. Both comparisons are not very appropriate because in the case of Atlantis we have a clearly identifiable historical author. In the other two cases we do not. 5. In the second chapter of this part, The Limitations of the Fact or Fiction Inquiry, page 13 to 18, Ellefsen repeats his mistaken belief that, in his, i.e. Plato's view, this Egyptian story, i.e. about the war between Athens and Atlantis, validated the Athenian foundational myth where Athena overpowered Poseidon during the reign of Cecrops, page 13. But why should Plato have sought validation of this Athenian story in an Egyptian tale? At the beginning of the Timaeus, Plato's Socrates states that he is interested in something totally different, i.e., in a tale that validates the superiority of an ideal state like the one conceived in the Republic. And for this, the Atlantis story as outlined by Plato's Critias works just fine. On the same page, Ellefsen evokes a poorly preserved Greek tradition that narrated the same events. But apart from the names mentioned in Critias 110 AB, nothing of this tradition is preserved in Greek sources that we know of. On page 15, Ellefsen claims that Plato did not advocate for philosophers or rulers fabricating their own stories. But what about the myth or fiction with which Socrates wants to convince the inhabitants of his ideal city that the golden ones among them are those fit to rule, while those of silver are to assist them, and those of bronze and iron are to serve as farmers and craftsmen? Repins 3pm 415-D. This fabrication is called noble fiction in Repins 3pm 414 billion cubic centimeters. On page 16, Ellefsen goes on to claim that Plato himself disfavored fabricating his own stories. But I wonder where we could find such a statement of Plato's, of an author who never speaks in his own voice. If Plato had really been adverse to fabricating stories, he would never have written a single dialogue. Part 2, a compilation of a shared story, starts with a discussion of Solon's manuscripts on Atlantis, page 19-22. One of the first sentences is that he, Solon Plato, this is unclear, suggested that the Atlantis story was a shared tradition between Egypt and Greece. P is 19. This is what this part sets put to prove, and in which it significantly fails. On page 22, we read an even bolder claim. We will explore the Egyptian story recorded in the temple of Neith at Sais that Solon found to be the same as the Athenian foundational myth. That foundational myth is the second chapter of this part, Solon's Greek sources, page 22-38. This chapter makes for some rather difficult reading, as Ellefsen tries to make sense of all and sundry Greek authors and texts that deal with Atlas, Atlantides, and Atlantis, apparently in the belief that they all talk about the same phenomena and people, which, alas, they do not. He proceeds with yet another bold assertion that quickly turns out to be wrong, page 22. First, we must turn to Plato's statement that, according to Solon, the Greeks preserved their own version of the war between the Athenians and the descendants of Poseidon. Nowhere in the Critias or Timaeus does Plato or Solon make the claim that the Greeks preserved their own version of this war, or why would the Egyptian priests have to tell Solon of this war? In Timaeus 23, A to C, these priests tell Solon explicitly that only they and not the Athenians have any real knowledge of it. The account of the mythographer Apollodorus, which Ellefsen presents next, says nothing about a war between the Athenians and the descendants of Poseidon, but describes a quarrel between the divinities Athena and Poseidon over the possession of Attica. A description of the same quarrel on an Attic vase found in Pantikapaeon shows not much more, except that now the god Dionysus and an unidentified goddess are present too. But again, Ellefsen talks about a war against Poseidon in Pars 23 factorial after presenting reports or depictions of later mythical quarrels over Athens, page 23-25. All of which have in fact nothing to do with the war evoked in the Timaeus and Critias. Ellefsen introduces what he calls an oral tradition derived from the Arcadians, which he claims Solon seems to have followed. Then we are presented with much material about Pelasgians, p. 25-29, and wonder what they have to do with Ellefsen's thesis. After that, we return to the Arcadian tradition, for which Ellefsen now introduces the author Hellanicus of Lesbos, mainly 5th century BCE. Ellefsen makes much of the fact that Hellanicus wrote a book called Atlantis, or even Atlantis, Ps 30, which, however, has nothing to do with Plato's Atlantis, but with the Atlantides 8 equals the daughters of the Titan Atlas. Ignoring this, Ellefsen blithely claims that Solon and Hellanicus borrowed from the Arcadian tradition the name Atlantis, Ps 30. He ignores that already Herodotus, whom Plato surely read, spoke of an Atlantis thalassa, Atlantic Sea, 1.202.4, and that Plato borrowed this expression from him, Crete 114c. Ellefsen now turns to various authors whom he regards as preservers of the Arcadian tradition because they connect the king or Titan Atlas in various ways with Arcadia, Ps 31-33. 9 Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who presents an Atlas who is the first king of Arcadia. Apollodorus, who narrates how the Titan Atlas fathered his 7 daughters, the Atlantides or Pleiades, in Arcadia, and Diodorus Siculus, who presents us with yet another Atlas, a son of Uranos. So these 3 authors deal with 3 different atlases, but according to Ellefsen, they are all the same. Page 33. These passages of Dionysius, Apollodorus, and Diodorus are consistent in describing an alternate story of Atlas as the king of Arcadia. These passages also show that the Arcadian tradition recorded by Hellanicus contained some core elements that are also present in Plato's Atlantis story. Atlas was allotted the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, the Atlantes built a walled city, Atlas's descendants ruled over the Isles of the Blessed in the midst of the ocean. It is really amazing how many false assertions these few sentences contain. There is no consistency in these very different tales concerning a man or god called Atlas. In Dionysius, he is king of Arcadia. In Apollodorus, a titan somehow connected with Arcadia. In Diodorus, the son of Uranos and living far to the west of Arcadia. The connection of these passages to Hellanicus is nowhere proven, and the core elements also present in Plato's Atlantis story are simply not there. In Plato's story, Atlas is not allotted the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, but a huge island in the middle of this ocean. Assuming that translation is correct, but there is nothing about Atlantis, who built a walled city, unless we assume round cities were walled, which in most cases is the case in the Middle East. That would mean the Atlantic Sea was the Mediterranean, but Plato always talks only about the Atlantean kings and never about the people. And Atlantis may contain a number of extraordinary features, but it is surely not identifiable with the Isles of the Blessed. Claiming any consistency between Plato's account and these texts is really quite brazen. However, more claims of non-existent consistency follow. A fragment of probable Hellenican origin 11 reports that Poseidon mated with Kalainos, correct to Kalaino. Their son was Lycos, whom his father settled in the Isles of the Blessed. In this case, Ellefsen, to his credit, actually balks at finding a similarity between Kalaino Telino and Plato's Cleito. Here, Plato was not following the traditional succession found in Hellanicus. Soon after that, he is not so cautious, finding a correspondence between Plato's Atlantean king named Azais and a mythic Arcadian king called Azaios XII or Azen. 13 after that, Ellefsen endeavors to find 2 other Arcadian characters in Solon's list of the Atlantean kings, Pima 34. Menesius 14, he connects with Menassinus or Menesileus, an obscure son of one of the Dioscuri mentioned in Pausanias, 2.2, 2.5, and Apollodorus 3.134 equals 3.11.2, who has, however, no connection to Arcadia. Just as far-fetched is, on page 35, the attempt to connect the name Ioimon with its easily discernible etymology 15, who is mentioned only once as one of the 50 sons of the Arcadian king Lycaon, Apollodorus 3.97 equals 3.8.7. Though Ellefsen recognizes the clear differences between the various passages as he shows on page 35s, he nevertheless insists on Hellanicus and Plato's treatment of the same subject, page 35, and even claims page 36. The work of Hellanicus is pivotal in the study of Plato's Atlantis because it shows the existence of a Greek tradition describing the Atlantean myths independent of Plato's work. Apart from the fact that most of the mythological snippets cited from various authors could not be traced back to Hellanicus with even a semblance of probability, this claim is rendered moot by the fact that the notions of Atlas or Atlantides in the non-Platonic texts have next to nothing to do with the notions of Atlas or Atlantis in Plato's Timaeus and Critias, only that it's associated to the place attachment to North Africa. Should we then just say Africa is Atlantis? No more is it justified to talk of Solon's rearrangement of these ubiquitous traditions into one single heroic cycle based on an Egyptian tale, pieces 36, for these traditions are neither ubiquitous but only laboriously put together from a few passages of widely disparate origins, nor can such a neatly constructed tale as Plato's Atlantis story be called a rearrangement of elements that have nothing in common with this story. To say that Solon and Hellanicus were treating the same subject in different ways, p. 37, does not do any justice to the actual texts, and to claim that Solon's position was similar to the tradition compiled by Diodorus betrays no knowledge whatsoever of how Diodorus actually worked. As I have shown about 24 years ago, 16 Diodorus' story is only a retelling of one of the extended mythical narratives of Dionysius Cytobrachion, a Hellenistic author of the 3rd century BCE, which is today known as the Libyan Stories, and which contains curious tales concerning Atlantioi. In part 3 of his book, Ellefsen tries to analyze Plato's attempt to refashion the Greek historical schema, page 39-56, right at the start, he claims. Page 39. Plato tried to bring the early chronology of other Greek states and Egypt into harmony with that of Athens. To do this, he used 3 distinctive sources: the Athenian tradition, about the strife between Athena and Poseidon, the local Arcadian tradition as to the origin of Atlas, and an Egyptian tale. This is not what we find in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias. There, Plato's speaker Critias claims to report just one source: a story about an ancient war between Athens and Atlantis, told to Solon by Egyptian priests and allegedly brought to Athens by him. If Plato really had used 3 sources, we might expect to find some fissures or discrepancies in what he reports. But there are none. In the chapter Athens was first, page 41-47, Ellefsen states that Eudoxus of Cnidus took the Egyptian notion of year to mean a lunar cycle, a month, Ps 45, and that Plato seems to have adopted the reasoning of Eudoxus for his chronology of Egypt, page 46-7. By following Eudoxus, Plato had the arguments to impugn Herodotus's historical schema, thus allowing for the argument that Athens was founded before Egypt, according to the Egyptian records at the Temple of Neith at Sais, as recalculated by Plato with Eudoxus's reduced count. The deeds of the Athenians against the invaders preceded in 1,000 years the foundation of the first human kingdom in Egypt. However, nowhere in Plato do we find any mention of any reckoning of Egyptian years as lunar months, nor do we find anywhere in Plato's preserved genuine works any explicit mention of Eudoxus. Moreover, nowhere in the Timaeus or Critias do we find a statement claiming that the deeds of the Athenians against the invaders preceded in 1,000 years the foundation of the first human kingdom in Egypt, in Tim. 23. The Egyptian priest tells Solon that the goddess Athena founded the Athenian state 1,000 years earlier than the city of Sais, but not that this state went to war 1,000 years before that foundation. Nor does the priest claim that Athena founded the first human kingdom in Egypt. This topic is, in fact, never raised. Ellefsen has simply not read Plato's texts carefully enough, after the short next chapter disputing the Athenian tradition, page 47-9. Ellefsen talks about synchronizing Athenian and Egyptian chronologies, Pedus 49-56, first presenting a longish introduction into Orphic texts and traditions and their alleged connections with Egypt, then pointing out the differences between their accounts of wars between the gods, Titanomachy, Gigantomachy, and the more traditional ones by Hesiod. His conclusions from all that on page 55 are once again highly speculative and questionable. From Herodotus, Plato could find the validation to Solon's account that the priests of Neith at Sais told the deeds of the Egyptian gods. Plato's use of the name Atlas suggests that when Solon redacted his list of the Atlantean kings, he associated the Atlantis story with the generation of the Titans. This same conclusion can be inferred from the chronological framework, where the deeds of the goddess Neith against the invaders preceded in 1,000 years the first mortal kingdoms in Egypt. But where in Solon's account do we find the deeds of the Egyptian gods? According to Plato's Critias, Solon's account merely covered the very earthly war between the Atlantean kings and the primeval Athenians, most likely the Mycenaeans. The claim that Solon associated the Atlantis story with the generation of the Titans because of the name Atlas likewise lacks any foundation. The Atlantean king Atlas is called Atlas because his island is called Atlantis, and Atlantis is called Atlantis because it is situated in or on the Atlantic Sea. And finally, which deeds of the goddess Neith against the invaders can be found in Solon's account? Also, the following claim is not supported by any available evidence, page 56. Plato placed the war between the Atlantis kingdom, led by Atlas, and Athens during the mythical foundation of Athens, where Athena and Poseidon disputed the land. Nowhere in Plato's Atlantis tale do we find the claim that the first King Atlas led the war against Athens. This is in fact explicitly contradicted by the statement that it took many generations, Criti, 120th before the Atlantean kings became power-hungry imperialists and attacked Athens. And in the mythical foundation of Athens, as told by Plato's Critias anyway, Criti 109 CD, no dispute between Athena and Poseidon is mentioned. The heading of the fourth part of the book finally announces the presentation of what Ellefsen most cares about, Solon's Egyptian sources, page 57 to 99. The first chapter of this part, however, treats something else entirely, Phericides of Syros and the Quest of Time, page 57 to 64. Here, Ellefsen claims that the most notable parallel to Solon's Atlantis among his contemporaries is found in Phericides of Syros, pages 58, a mythographer and kind of proto-philosopher of the 6th century BCE. Ellefsen describes the alleged connection between Phericides and Solon thus, p. 59. Two central aspects of Phericides' work have a connection with Solon's Atlantis. The first is his cosmogony, where Solon mentioned Kronos as the personification of time. The second is the war of Ophion against Kronos and Zeus. Firstly, the claim that Solon mentioned Kronos as the personification of time, which then might be in line with Phericides' identification of Kronos and Kronos equals time, is downright false. In France 36.3 West, Solon mentions a court process of time, but there is not the slightest hint that this Kronos has anything to do with the Titan Kronos. The only mention of Kronos in the surviving fragments of Solon's writings is found in fragment 31.1 West, where Solon exhorts his audience to pray to Zeus, the son of Kronos. There is no connection between these two fragments whatsoever, and it is a mystery to me how one can deduce from them that Solon identified Kronos with Kronos. Secondly, the war of Ophion against Kronos and Zeus is just one more misleading notion, because Phericides nowhere, in the material ascribed to him, spoke of a war between Ophion and both Kronos and Zeus, but just between Ophion and Kronos. And how this war between two divine powers can be equated with the war between the two earthly powers, Atlantis and Athens, is once again Ellefsen's mystery. He now throws in summaries of Egyptian, Phoenician and Babylonian tales of wars between various gods, an Ennead of gods against Apophis, Yam against Baal, the followers of Tiamat against Marduk. But why should Solon, or rather Plato, have taken any of these as inspiration for his Atlantis tale, unless these are metaphors for kings of the Middle East as an echoing of the Persian Empire? In the next short chapter, devoted Solon's Egyptian wisdom, page 64 to 67, Ellefsen tries to establish a connection with Solon's longest preserved poetic text, the so-called Elegy to the Muses, 413 West, and an Egyptian wisdom text, the so-called Satire of the Trades. If you look closely enough, however, the resemblance between these two texts is totally superficial. In the Elegy to the Muses, Solon's remarks on the dangers and contingencies of various human professions are developed within a train of thought that tries to find out about the human condition in general, while the Satire of the Trades has the aim of praising the art of the scribe by comparing it favorably to the shortcomings of other professions. The following chapter tries to corroborate Solon's connection with such Egyptian texts by presenting considerations on the Egyptian source of Plato's Phaedrus 274c to 275b, page 67 to 80. In this Phaedrus passage, Socrates narrates a tale that supposedly took place in Egyptian Thebes. There, the god Theuth, who came from Naucratis, tried to convince King Thamus, not Un, as Ellefsen writes, of the usefulness of art of writing, which he, Theuth, had invented, but failed. Now, in the evaluation of this story, Ellefsen makes two important mistakes. Firstly, he presents a quite correct translation of the beginning of the story. I heard, says Socrates, then, that at Naucratis in Egypt was one of the ancient gods, and the name of the god himself was Theuth. But in his interpretation of this story, he gravely distorts this statement by claiming that Socrates, the character of Plato's dialogue, heard this story at Naucratis in Egypt. PG 68. This is not what the text says, nor do we have any information about Socrates having ever been in Egypt. So we do not really know where the story of Theuth and Thamus originated, and in this context, Ellefsen makes his second important mistake. He totally ignores Phaedrus's concluding comment on the story narrated by Socrates, although he even quotes it at the end of the translated passage, page 68. Socrates, you easily make up stories of Egypt or any country you please. So even Plato's dialogue partner in the Phaedrus is convinced that Socrates has made up this story himself. Why then should we believe that it has a real Egyptian background? The story itself is very much concerned with real being and only the appearance of being, and this is a fundamentally Platonic and not Egyptian concept. Apart from this, much space of this chapter is taken up by comparing the story in the Phaedrus with possible Egyptian counterparts and by discussing the Greek reception of the Egyptian god Amun-Amon. All this leads to a lot of surmising, with phrases like may indicate, may infer, the evidence suggest, seems to have, he was possibly using, and so on. This phraseology indicates that we are in the realm of mushy speculation, not solid evidence. The next 3 chapters, the context of the satire of the trades in the New Kingdom literature, page 81 to 84, the story of the Astarte papyrus and the Ugaritic Baal cycle, page 84 to 91, Philo of Bylos and the secret writings of Thoth, page 91-99 are best taken together because they have the aim to prove the thesis that is most succinctly formulated on page 100, to the extent that the story contained in the Astarte papyrus may have been the source of Solon's Atlantis account, and the Ugaritic Baal cycle gives us an insight into the missing text of the Astarte papyrus. We can find in the Ugaritic texts a structure, passages, and details that reappears in Plato's Atlantis. A few pages earlier, Ellefsen formulates a similar but more cautious thesis, page 91. The sources of the Atlantis story may have been a collection of Egyptian texts ascribed to Thoth that juxtaposed the satire of the trades, the myth of the Eye of Re, and the story contained in the Astarte papyrus. It is significant that in both theses, the phrase may have been plays a central role. All the trains of thought contained in these 19 pages, page 81 to 99, are indeed far from offering any solid evidence for the 2 theses I have just quoted. The Astarte papyrus, first introduced on page 82, is a very truncated text written in the later 15th century BCE, and to supplement its contents, Ellefsen uses the Ugaritic Baal cycle, which came to light on cuneiform tablets that were discovered around 1930 in the ruins of the West Semitic city of Ugarit on the coast of northern Syria. In the third of the 3 chapters mentioned earlier, Ellefsen tries to show, page 91, that the story contained in the Astarte papyrus and the Ugaritic Baal cycle survived until the 2nd century AD, namely in the Phoenician history written by Herennius Philo of Byblos, circa 64 to 141 CE, allegedly preserving an account written by the Phoenician priest Sanchuniathon of Berytus, Wa'ed Beirut, who purportedly lived before 1200 BCE, which however is highly doubtful. All of this is only known because the Christian writer Eusebius of Caesarea, about 260 to 339 CE, has preserved fragments of Philo's work in his own Praeparatio Evangelica. Ellefsen detects a striking resonance of these fragments with the Egyptian sources of Plato, piece 94s. He never considers that this resonance might simply be the result of Philo having directly read Plato, who had lived about 400 years earlier. Ignoring this very real possibility, Ellefsen presses on page 96. The original Egyptian source of the Atlantis story could have begun with an introduction describing the deeds of Thoth, followed by other gods' inventions. Such juxtaposed text would have been consistent with the New Kingdom literature, which integrated historical fictions to scribal and wisdom texts in the style of the satire of the trades. The Egyptian source may have been an inspiration for Plato's tale of Thoth, as well as a short introduction to the Atlantis story. Note once again the proliferation of phrases like could have begun, would have been, and may have been. As corroboration, Ellefsen also adduces Diodorus's account of the Atlantean myths, p. 96. But here again the problem of chronology crops up. We know that Diodorus's account is just a retelling of a mythological novel created by Dionysius Scytobrachion, 3rd century BCE, who certainly used Plato as one of his sources. Ellefsen reconstructs the main elements of the story that he regards as the source of the Atlantis tale in the following way, page 99. The common theme of these stories is the battle of the divine heroes against the sea god and its followers, the victory over the sea god, and the foundation of a palace marking the kingship of the triumphant god. I fail to see that any of these elements have any close resemblance with what Plato's Timaeus and Critias narrate about Atlantis and its war against primeval Athens. Instead of looking to Egypt in regards to a war, Ellefsen may have to look to the Hittites. There follows the most extensive part of Ellefsen's book, titled The List of the Atlantean Kings, page 100 to 165. One of its aims is to prove the thesis that, page 100. We can find in the Ugaritic texts a structure, passages, and details that reappears in Plato's Atlantis. In the first 4 chapters of this part, the foundation of Athens, page 100 to 103, the names of the women, page 103 to 107, Poseidon as Yam, page 107s, the twin Atlantean kings without Kronos, page 108 to 113, Ellefsen grapples with various difficulties that might undermine the just enunciated thesis. One of them is that there is no mention of Greece or Athens in the Ugaritic texts, but only in Philo of Byblos' rather late account. This is sufficient for Ellefsen to conclude without any evidence, page 101. The foundation of Athens may already have been embedded in the Egyptian priest account, following some sort of commentary that guided his interpretation, which resulted in the equation of the interlude of the battles of Anath in her palace with the foundational myth of Athens describing the strife between Athena and Poseidon. The strife between Athena and Poseidon is mentioned several times in these chapters. Apparently, it does not bother Ellefsen that this strife is no part of the Atlantis story as narrated in Plato's Timaeus and Critias. He even goes on to say, page 102, similar to Athena in Plato's Atlantis, Anath had a central role in the fight against the sea deity Yam. But Athena has no central role in Plato's Atlantis narrative. She's only mentioned as having, and this not alone but together with Hephaestus, implanted the primeval Athenians in Attica, and as having inspired them with the constitution of their newly founded state, Crete, 109 CD. Similarly, Ellefsen misinterprets the statement, Crete 110 Abhai, that according to Solon, the Egyptian priests narrated the war using the names Kekrops, Erechtheus, etc. And that of the women, page 103, the names of these women seem to refer to the daughters of Cecrops and the rituals preserved in the Athenian festival of the Panathenaia in their honor. But as far as we can see, these rituals play no part whatsoever in the narrative of the confrontation between Atlantis and Athens. Plato's Critias simply wanted to say that the names of females that were a part of Athenian mythical stories also appeared in the Egyptian priests' narrative of the Atlantean War. Ellefsen then discusses the difficulty arising from the name Atlas, page 107. Solon's choice of the name Poseidon made an Olympian god, Poseidon, the father of a Titan, Atlas. All difficulties disappear, however, if we simply do not identify the Titan with the Atlantean king. As I already mentioned above, page 7. Poseidon's eldest son Atlas was called Atlas because he was born on the island of Atlantis across the Atlantic Sea. After presenting a list on page 113th of the first 10 Atlantean kings, as mentioned in Crete, 114a to c with what he thinks are their equivalents in the Ugaritic texts, Philo of Byblos and the Arcadian tradition, Ellefsen then sets out to justify this list. The chapter, The Translation of the Names, page 113 to 116 dwells very much on Plato's thoughts on the meaning and understanding of names in the dialogue Cratylus, with Ellefsen concluding p. 116. These guiding principles are applicable to the interpretation of names of the Atlantean kings. We find that when Solon translated the names of the Atlantean kings, he preserved a discernible meaning of the foreign names. But how does Ellefsen know that already Solon subscribed to the same guiding principles as Plato in the Cratylus? In general, Ellefsen does distinguish too little between Solon and Plato in his book. As I already said, he never once questions whether we can take anything that is reported about Solon in Timaeus and Critias for granted. Before, however, we come to the names of the Atlantean kings in detail, Ellefsen now inserts a chapter about the translation of Orichalcum, page 116 to 120, in which he tries to show that Orichalcum is identical with the red gold mentioned in Ugaritic texts. He seems to base this on the characterization of Orichalcum with having a fiery sparkle, which, however, does not necessarily mean a red hue. In fact, nowhere in the Critias Orichalcum is associated with the color red. There follows the first Ugaritic explanation of an Atlantean king's name. Atlas stands for Attar, page 120s. But Ellefsen makes this equation explicitly regarding the Titan Atlas, Ps 120, who has no connection with the Atlantean king of the name, see above. Next, Ellefsen has to grapple with the fact that the deity Mot, who is so prominent in the Ugaritic Baal cycle, appears nowhere in the Atlantis narrative. The muddy waters of Mot, P 121 to 125, or does he? Ellefsen now takes his refuge with the beginning of the account of Philo of Byblos, Apostol, Eus Praep Ev, 1.102, where we find an entity called Mot, translated as mud or putrefaction of a watery mixture. In Philo's account, this is the founding substance of all creation, but Ellefsen has no difficulties with connecting this Mot with the muddy waters that were left after Atlantis had sunk beneath the waves, page 124. A connection taken out of context and as far-fetched as one can possibly imagine. The next chapter, however, exhibits a probably even more ingenious combination. Eumelos Gaderos was Shad Kadesh, Ps 125 to 132. The feats of Ellefsen's logic can be illustrated by a few quotations. It is possible that the double name of Shad Kadesh gave rise to the counterpart found in Plato under the double name Eumelos Gadeiros, punct 129. The only problem is that in Plato this is not a double name, but according to Plato's Critias, Criti, one, Eumelos, is the Greek translation of the other, Gaderos. The name Kadesh seems to be behind the name Gaderos in Plato, preserving its phonetics and mythical associations. Ibid. With this assertion, we are definitely in the realm of freely associating X with Y. Under the Greek prism, it was reasonable for Solon to equate the episode of Shad Kadesh battling Anath, Milku, and Reshef to the labors of Heracles, which were associated with the Phoenician name Gadir, Ibid. Like Heracles, who robbed the cattle of Geryon in the vicinity of Gadir in the Atlantic coast, the Ugaritic Milku and Reshef fought the calf of El in the confines of the habitable world. Punct 130. So, fighting a calf is apparently equivalent with robbing cattle. The Egyptians adopted the Syrian god Reshef, and the gates that Reshef guarded in the horizon were associated with the Pillars of Shu, and Herodotus and other authors attested that these Egyptian myths were interpreted as the labors of Heracles and the pillars of Heracles of the Greek myths. Ibid. For these interesting observations, Ellefsen cites in N. Nelia Cumenta Nelia on p. 254, Herodotus 2.43-44, where, however, one finds not the slightest hint of Shu or of pillars either of Shu or of Heracles. Therefore, the Geryon of the Greek tradition, recast by Diodorus as Hesperus of the Atlantean tradition, corresponds to the Ugaritic Shad. Apart from the truly breathtaking leap from the Greek via the Atlantean to the Ugaritic tradition in this not very long sentence, one may well ask how relevant this is, given that neither the Greek Geryon, nor the Atlantean Hesperus, nor the Ugaritic Shad play any role in Plato's Atlantis story. And now to the triumphant conclusion page, 131c. The evidence suggests that Solon may have equated the name Shad Kadesh with Gadira and the calf of El with the cattle of Geryon/Hesperus, and the peculiarity of the double name Shad Kadesh appeared as a double name in Plato as Eumelos Gaderos. So Solon equated the name of a deity, Shad Kadesh, with a location, Gadara, and then Plato did muddle things up further. We really must be grateful to Ellefsen for clearing up this mess, although I still do not see what the calf of El, the cattle of Geryon Hesperus, and a double name that in the Critias is no double name at all have to do with the Atlantis story. The next 5 chapters, the descendants of the Dioscuri, page 132-4, Ampheres was a well-fitting translation of Attack, page 135-80, Nisias can be understood as Yadi Yalhan, page 138, Elasippos sheds light on the name Helel, son of Shahar, page 139-43, and Azais brings to light the meaning of the Ugaritic Zizu, page 143-148. proceed from the notion that somehow the Dioscuri, being twin heroes, gods of Greek myth, played a role in the Atlantis story, possibly, because the first Atlantean kings were 5 pairs of twins. Indeed, Ellefsen strives mightily to find connections. He points out that the wives of the Dioscuri were called Leucipides, meaning daughters of Leucippos, and that Leucippa was the name of the mother of Cleito, with whom Poseidon fathered the just-mentioned 5 pairs of twins. But things already start to go wrong when Ellefsen states that the Leucippides were the personifications of the horses that accompanied the moon goddess Selene. Page 132. No, they were called daughters of Leucippos, because that was their real father's name. But this Leucippos has nothing to do with Leucippa, mother of Cleito. Next, Ellefsen is intrigued by the fact that the first of the 3rd pair of these twins is called Menesius, and surmises that the name Menesenus, 37 of the son of one of the Dioscuri, Polydeuces, is a possible variant of the name Menesius. Again, this is only a flimsy connection. As for Ampheres, the name of the first of the 2nd pair of twins, Ellefsen constructs a connection with an Ugaritic deity called Atak that is just as tenuous, as is shown by the proliferation of hedging phrases, here indicated by italics, page 137. It is probable that the name of the Ugaritic demon Atak was preserved in association with its nautical name in the Egyptian version of the myth. If this was the case, then the Egyptian priest could have explained the meaning of his name, which resulted in the correspondence between the meaning of Ampheres and Atak, where both have the connotation of joined on both sides or binding associated with a boat. On page 138, the identification of Menesius with the Ugaritic deity Yadi Yalhan is based on, as Ellefsen claims, similar meanings of these names. Menesius can be understood as mindful one who remembers, Yadi Yalhan as he knows he understands. Is that really so close? Regarding Ellesippos, the first of the 4th pair of twins among the first Atlantean kings, we get the following explanation, page 139. The name of Ellesippos was associated with the notion of a horse-driven chariot personifying the light of the moon or the sun. This meaning would be consistent with the image of a chariot depicted behind Poseidon in the west pediment of the Parthenon. We may infer that whereas the horses in the west pediment of the Parthenon were the wives of the Dioscuri, Phoebe and Hilaira, personifying some aspect of the moonlight, the name of the chariot was Ellesippos, as a masculine aspect of the moonlight. Here is where we find the connection with the Ugaritic texts. The free-ranging associations exhibited in this passage are quite breathtaking. First of all, Ellesippos means horse-driving, not horse-driven. So Ellesippos cannot really be the name of a chariot, but only of its driver. Secondly, not every horse-driven chariot can be taken as automatically personifying the light of the moon or the sun. Furthermore, why on earth should we assume that the horses in the west pediment of the Parthenon were the wives of the Dioscuri, personifying some aspect of the moonlight, and that the name of the chariot was Ellesippos as a masculine aspect of the moonlight? If that really is the connection with the Ugaritic texts, it might as well not exist. The curious gender metamorphosis from the wives of the Dioscuri as the horses of Poseidon's chariot to the masculinity of the chariot named Ellesippos resurfaces once more at the end of Ellefsen's identification with an Ugaritic deity, page 143. Therefore, Plato's Ellesippos, as a translation of the Ugaritic god HL, would fit a male personification of Hilaira, the light of the crescent moon, seen as a horse-driven chariot represented in the west pediment of the Parthenon. A real highlight of this identification game, however, is presented in the next chapter dealing with Azais, the first of the 5th pair of twins of Atlantean kings. After 5 pages of intricate considerations, we read, page 148. If we accept that the Atlantean king Azais was connected to the Ugaritic god Zizu and Solon intended to preserve in this personage some elements of the Anzu bird mythology, a very interesting component of Plato's narrative emerges. The Anzu bird mythology was associated with the mountain winds as a curse for breaking the oaths of friendship. This was the main plot of the Atlantis story. The Atlantean kings broke their fraternal oath to uphold the laws provided by Poseidon and to not make war to each other. Due to their corruption, they broke this oath, causing the disappearance of their land in a flood by the will of Zeus. We may conjecture that, had Plato finished his narrative, Azais would have been the first king to break this oath. unleashing the curse that ultimately caused the demise of the kingdom of Atlantis. There is so much wrong here that unraveling it will take some space. To say that the main plot of the Atlantis story consists in breaking the oaths of friendship, which resulted in the fulfillment of a curse, cannot be based on any detail of Plato's story. There is no mention of a curse in this story at all, and the corruption suffered by the kings of Atlantis does not find an expression in their fighting against each other, only the emphasis for the unity of a nation. The final passage of the Critias tells a quite different story. Criti, 121 AB, but when the divine part in them vanished, because it was mixed with mortal things, and the human character gained the upper hand, then they were no longer able to endure their present state and acted in an ugly manner. And to those who could see, they appeared ugly, as they gambled away the most beautiful of their most valuable possessions. But to those who were not able to perceive a true life with its orientation towards happiness, they seemed just then to be beautiful and favored by happiness, while they filled themselves with unjust greed and power. This unjust greed and power does not manifest itself in making war upon each other, as Ellefsen would have it, but in imperialist expansion, as we can learn from the summary of the story in the Timaeus, Tim. 25a to c. Nor is it true that these imperialist kings caused the disappearance of their land in a flood by the will of Zeus. The just mentioned Timaeus passage makes it abundantly clear that the defeat of the Atlantean forces by the brave Athenians and the flooding of Atlantis are in no way connected with each other. Plato's Critias explicitly states, Tim. 25 CD. In a later time, extraordinary earthquakes and floodings happened, and there came one dreadful day and night, when your, i.e. the Athenian military force, altogether was buried in the earth, and in the same way the island of Atlantis sank under the sea and vanished. In this description, the destruction of both the Athenian army and the island of Atlantis is a totally natural event, such that of Santorini, and has nothing to do with divine punishment, only in the allegorical sense. Finally, Ellefsen's conjecture that Azais would have been the first king to break this oath, unleashing the curse that ultimately caused the demise of the kingdom of Atlantis, once again totally disregards what Plato's Critias says. It was only after many generations, Criti 120e, that corruption set in among the Atlantean kings, causing their imperialist adventure, echoing Persia and subsequent defeat. So Azais, belonging to the very first generation of Atlantean kings, simply cannot have done what Ellefsen claims. All in all, Ellefsen has outlined an interesting follow-up of the Atlantis story here, which however has nothing to do with what Plato ever intended. Also, the explanations Ellefsen tries to give for the remaining 4 names of the Atlantean kings enumerated by Plato's Critias labor under various mistakes and misconceptions. For the explanation of the name Uemon 38, the second of the second pair of twins, treated p. 148 to 155, Ellefsen turns to a passage in Homer's Iliad 5.769-239, where a hero named Eurypylus, the shining son of Uaimon, plays a role. Alas, from the start, Ellefsen misquotes and misunderstands the decisive words of this passage. Reading, page 149. Evaemon, not Evaemonus, aglaos, and then Pars 153, translating shining Euaimon, even imputing this wrong understanding to the Greek native speaker, Solon ibid 40. Solon may have understood that the name shining Euaimon was the equivalent to the Egyptian translation of the original Ugaritic form of Mot and the Shining One. Surely, though, Solon would not have made Ellefsen's grave mistake of reading Ivaemon aglaos instead of Ivaemonos aglaos, and thus this explanation vanishes into thin air. In the next chapter, The Two Autochthons, page 155 to 158, Ellefsen turns to the second twin of the third pair and proposes an ingenious explanation of his name, page 157s. The name autochthon, relate, sick, perhaps may relate, to a peculiar manifestation of Atar. Above, we mentioned that the god Atar was the rival of Baal, and Philo translated this name into Greek as Atlas. Atar came down from Baal's throne and became king over the earth. So Atar had 2 manifestations, one as the starry sky, and another as a god in the netherworld. Conceivably, Solon translated the astral manifestation of Atar as Atlas, while the particular manifestation of Ata as the ruler over the earth was translated as autochthon. Regarding this, as I said, ingenious reconstruction, the only remaining question is, why would Solon do any such thing? Why would he give the name sprung from the earth, autochthon, to a god of whom he knew, according to Ellefsen, that he had descended from heaven? For the explanation of the name of the second twin of the fourth pair, Mestor was an unloose translation of Mysore page. 158 to 60, Ellefsen actually falls back on an idea first uttered by the godfather of all modern Atlantologists, Ignatius Donnelly. It has long been proposed that behind the Atlantean king named Mestor was the Phoenician god Mysore, page 158. Ellefsen recognizes the problems connected with this identification, but in the end acquiesces in it. For the one remaining name of the second twin of the fifth pair, Diaprepes, and the identification of its holder with Yadid the hero, Ellefsen resorts to a famous passage of the Athenian historian Thucydides, i.e., his description of the honors the Athenians bestowed on soldiers fallen in war, the reason for this connection being that in this description, the adjective diaprepes is used to characterize the courage of the Athenians who had fallen in the Battle of Marathon as illustrious. Now, Ellefsen is surely right when he assumes that Plato was familiar with this Thucydides passage, but then he goes on to claim that Solon, who lived more than 100 years before Thucydides, was familiar with it too, page 162. The salient details of these rituals bring back the textual reference from Thucydides that Solon used for the translation of the name Diaprepes. These were the parallelisms that Solon must have seen in the passage from Thucydides. Therefore, Solon seems to have chosen the name Diaprepes based on the meaning of one of the names attached to the god of death, Mot, under his warrior manifestation with the name Yadid, and the references to rituals found in the Ugaritic texts. Surely, this chronological sloppiness does not inspire confidence in Ellefsen's reasoning. Ellefsen's conclusion on the relation between the Egyptian and the Ugaritic myths, page 162-5, and its meaning for the Atlantis story is such, page 163s. Solon introduced the Atlantis story based on the Egyptian account on Seth-Baal against Yam and his followers. Solon heard a story based on the Egyptian records stored in the library of the Temple of Sais. Many of them related to the combat of Seth-Baal against the sea and other demons as a magical incantation to cure Asiatic maladies. The central story presented by the Egyptian priest to Solon had a Syrian origin. The names in the Egyptian version were Semitic. The Egyptian priests of Sais preserved the story describing the strife between Seth-Baal against Yam found in the Astarte papyrus. This is the story Solon heard at Sais. This reconstruction raises several questions Ellefsen never faces. First, why would Solon have been interested in such a story in the first place? None of the surviving fragments of his poetry show the slightest interest in relating mythical combats between gods of other cultures unless it was culturally adapted to their identity. Second, what drove him to transform this mythical combat story into a historic one between his Athenians, who surely played no role whatsoever in these Semitic Egyptian tales, and an imperialist empire situated to the west of the Mediterranean, i.e., a region of which neither the inhabitants of Ugarit nor of Egypt had ever heard of? Unless this is all simply in the Hittite context of the Trojan Wars. There follows the last extensive part of Ellefsen's book, Description of the Atlantis in relation to Plato's dialogue, page 166 to 212. The first chapters of this part are unexceptionable, presenting an outline of classical Greek city planning, the city planners, page 166-7041, and an overview of the description of the island of Atlantis, Ps 171-3, as found in the dialogue Critias. Things get more interesting in the next chapter, A City Next to the Sea, Wealth and War, page 174-80, with a number of inaccuracies and mistakes cropping up again. It is, e.g., at least an inaccuracy to describe the metropolis of Atlantis as a circular moated hill, page 174, because that hill formed only the innermost core of the metropolis, see Crete 113, c to e. It is also inaccurate to claim, Ibididas, that in Timaeus 19b to c, Plato stated that one of the reasons he introduced the Atlantis story was to see in motion the states described in the Republic, In the Timaeus passage, Plato's Socrates stated his explicit wish to see the ideal state conceived by him in motion and tested by war, and not a plurality of states. Downright mistaken is the notion, expressed on page 175, that the Atlantes had courage as their main virtue. This is stated nowhere in Timaeus or Critias, and, as I already said, above P 4. Plato's Critias also never speaks about the Atlantes, but only about their kings. In Plato's conception of the story, Atlantis is not an equal counterpart of Athens, but the villain of the story. Wrong are also the following claims about Atlantis, page 176. The accumulation of wealth at the expense of virtue and wisdom, Plato claimed, debilitated and corrupted the state. In Plato's view, it was the wealth of the Atlantean kings that corrupted their state and their fraternal oaths to respect the laws provided by Poseidon, causing the disappearance of their land in a flood by the will of Zeus. Neither did Plato claim that the accumulation of wealth at the expense of virtue and wisdom was the reason for Atlantis's corruption. It was the vanishing of the divine part of the souls of the Atlantean kings. Crete. 121 AB -- nor had the breaking of their fraternal oaths to respect the laws provided by Poseidon anything to do with it, nor did their punishment consist in the disappearance of their land in a flood by the will of Zeus. See already above, page 16. The very first sentence of the next chapter, the city as part of the cosmos, the circular city, page 178-81 is highly problematic. Plato described the circular city of Atlantis as having a divine character, possible reflection of Persian cities. In corroboration of this statement, Ellefsen adduces the passage Timaeus 24c-e, but there we hear only about Athens as having been founded by the divine wisdom of Athena, while the first reference to the power of Atlantis in Tim 24e is already connected with Hybris. At least one of the details given of the description of the Atlantean metropolis on page 180 is misleading. Atlantis had its center in a column where its laws were inscribed. According to Crete 119 CD, this column stood in the center of the island in a sanctuary of Poseidon, Katamesin Tineson en Iero Poseidonos. Ellefsen seems to think that this description refers to the enclosure of Cleito and Poseidon in the central island of the metropolis, Crete. 116c, but not only the wording of 119 CD excludes this, but also the fact that the sanctuary in which the column stood also contained freely roaming wild bulls, and the area required for this would simply not have fitted into the central island of the metropolis. 43. It is also much more appropriate that this column stands at the very center of Atlantis Island, with equal access from all the territories ruled by the 10 kings. At the end of this chapter, Ellefsen claims that the description of the central plain of the island of Atlantis was based on Egyptian sources. Page 181, and in the following chapter, the Greek tradition from the underworld to the Nile and back to Atlantis. Page 181-190. He sets out to prove this. He starts, however, with some notions about the Greek beyond that need clarification and/or correction. Page 182. Greek poets related that the extreme west was the primitive land of Kronos and the refuge of the Titans. Among the mythical lands at the edge of the world were the Isles of the Blessed, and even further was the abyss called Tartarus. The Isles of the Blessed did not only shelter the souls of the heroes, but it was also inhabited by the descendants of Atlas. The Pelasgian Lycos, the grandson of Atlas and son of Poseidon and the nymph Selaino, was the mythical king of Thebes that later reigned as king of the Isles of the Blessed. Several things have gone wrong here, starting with the vague claim Greek poets related. The notion that the Tartarus simply lay beyond the Isles of the Blessed cannot be sustained. Tartarus is usually conceived as being the vertically lowest point of the underworld. To say that the Isles of the Blessed were inhabited by the descendants of Atlas is simply not true. This is stated only for one of them, Lycos, and this Lycos is not a mythical king of Thebes. Ellefsen has conflated him with another Lycos 44. Nor is it said that he reigned as king of the Isles of the Blessed. Ellefsen, page 183, also conflates the different conceptions of the world that Plato outlines in his dialogues Phaedo and Timaeus, although these cannot really be harmonized with each other. Further pages of this chapter, page 186 to 90, are taken up by describing how Plato used Egyptian material that he could find in the work of Herodotus or in the Busiris of his own contemporary Isocrates. In the short chapter, All the Egyptian Roads Lead to the Underworld, page 190-1, Ellefsen once more wrongly asserts that the Isles of the Blessed were the residence of the descendants of Atlas, page 190. He bases this claim on a reference to Hellanicus's Atlantis, but none of the known fragments of this work 47 supports this assertion. The next chapter, The Fields of Yam and the Muddy Waters Left in the Ocean, page 191-6, exhibits interesting examples of circular reasoning. The first one is on page 192. Philo recognized the attributes of the Ugaritic mot into two distinct manifestations: the mud or watery putrescence of the underworld and the god of death Muth. Plato retained the notion of mud or watery putrescence as the remains of the sunken Atlantis. Here we can observe that Plato kept some of the elements that related to the underworld of the original story. Therefore, we can infer that the Astarte papyrus followed the Ugaritic texts in mentioning the realm of the dead in the underworld, which formed the basis for Plato's description of the Atlantis. So, without having really proven the Ugaritic underworld formed the basis for Plato's description of the Atlantis, Ellefsen nevertheless shows himself confident that we can use Plato's description of the Atlantis to supplement missing parts of the Astarte papyrus. We get more circular reasoning on page 195. Solon's description of Atlantis had two components, one from Syria, related to the residents of Yam, and another from Egypt, related to the underworld as described in spell 110 of the Book of the Dead. The narrative of this Egyptian map accompanying the Astarte papyrus must have preserved some elements of the Syrian account of the underworld. This can be inferred from Plato's account, where he described the residence of Atlas on top of a mountain in the island of Atlantis, which was the source of two water springs. The source of this description seems to be the residence of El and Yam, which was in a mountain located at the spring of two rivers. Once again, Plato's account is confidently used to speculate about lost parts of the Astarte papyrus. To be noted, too, is the ease with which Ellefsen bends some details in Plato's account to make them look more similar to their presumed Egyptian or Ugaritic sources. The residence of Atlas is now located on top of a mountain. Actually, Plato's Critias talks only about a mount that was low on all sides, Criti 113c, and a hill, Gilophos 113d, which does not imply much height either, but more of a temple platform like ones found in Persia and some in Egypt. Furthermore, two water springs are not the same as a spring of two rivers. With that kind of reasoning, you really can make everything look like everything else. The next short chapter deals with the geographic location, page 196 to 70. Again, Ellefsen confidently points to Egyptian sources, page 197. Plato had as reference other Greek authors who concluded that the Egyptian pillars of Shu were equivalent to the Greek pillars of Heracles. It is well attested that Greeks associated Heracles with the Egyptian god Shu and the Theban Khonsu. This association can be found in Herodotus in his description of Egypt. One would really like to know who those Greek authors were who concluded that the Egyptian pillars of Shu were equivalent to the Greek pillars of Heracles. In the mythical Egyptian conception of the world, the pillars of Shu numbered 4, located at the cardinal points of the world, and helped Shu, who in this conception is an Atlas-like figure, to maintain the separation of earth and sky. The pillars of Hercules, on the other hand, are only 2, and in the Greek worldview, they are located at the western end of the Mediterranean, at least since the early 5th century BCE, 100 years before Plato. Ellefsen, however, seems to think that these two very different sets of pillars can be equated, because Greeks associated Heracles with the Egyptian god Shu, and he believes he can confirm this by pointing to 2 Herodotus passages, in N 610 on page 269. Alas, nothing in these passages gives any hint that Shu is involved here. Undeterredly, however, Ellefsen presses on. By establishing the association of the pillars of Shu with the Greek pillars of Heracles, Plato interpreted that the Egyptian fields of reeds and Hittip were equivalent to the Greek Isles of the Blessed. This proves a very important conclusion because it allowed Plato to construe that the Egyptian description of the underworld regions were a complement to the Greek tradition, describing the entrance to the Hades and the residence of Atlas in the western horizon. But why on earth should Plato really need these interpretations and complements? His Critias never talks about the Isles of the Blessed or of the underworld in his Atlantis story. Unless this is a reference to the agricultural allotments, in that case, Isles of the Blessed would be Egypt. Ellefsen, however, will not desist, as the next two chapters, the topography, page 197 to 99, the rituals and abundance of the fields of reeds and Hittep, page 199,203 show he believes that, piece 197. Plato's description of the island of Atlantis was also modeled after the Egyptian fields of reeds and Hetep, as described in the spell 110 of the Book of the Dead. As evidence for this, he presents, on page 199, a drawing 50 of a map depicting the field of reeds as a rectangular plane crossed by channels. In reality, however, this drawing does not show a rectangular plane crossed by channels, but a number of parallel horizontal registers, as in a modern comic strip, that exhibits very little similarity with the plain of Atlantis as described by Plato's Critias in Crete, 118a, 118 CD. But with Ellefsen's logic, we might as well say the island of Atlantis is Egypt's oasis. Ellefsen then turns to the fascinating ritual of the Atlantean kings described in Crete, 119d to 120c, claiming p 199s. It appears that Plato reinterpreted the Egyptian rituals described in the fields of reeds and Hetep and merged various parts of these rituals into a single event performed by the Atlantean kings. Plato mentioned that the Atlantean kings, all of them brothers, gathered in a precinct next to the temple where Cleito gave birth to them. In this precinct, the kings performed the ritual hunt of the bull. All these elements of the Atlantis rituals are found in the spell 110 of the Book of the Dead. Already in the description of the ritual as described in the Critias, Ellefsen gets several things wrong. Apart from the very first generation, the kings cannot have been all brothers. With each generation, they became more loosely related to each other. That the location where the bull hunt and the subsequent rituals took place cannot have been the precinct next to the temple where Cleito gave birth to them was already shown above on page 19. As for the claim that all these elements of the Atlantis rituals are found in the spell 110 of the Book of the Dead, a few examples will be sufficient to prove that this is simply not true. As for the hunt of the bull, Ellefsen can only come up with this page 201. The Egyptian spell said, that the soul sailed through the lake Uak and Chephet. There the soul performed a ritual. I am the bull, which is tied with a rope of lapis lazuli. The quote goes on a bit longer, but no hunt is mentioned. To be frank, I do not see the slightest similarity between this soul in the underworld who imagines herself to be a bull tied up somewhere, and the bulls hunted by the Atlantean kings in a sanctuary of Poseidon in the center of their large island. Ellefsen does not do much better trying to find an equivalent in spell 110 to the impressive dark blue robes worn by the Atlantean kings in the latter part of their ritual, Crete. 120b. He comes up with this, page 201. The detail of the blue garment has its parallel in spell 110, where it said, O Chephet, I have come into thee. I array myself in apparel, and I gird myself the luant garment of Ra. Elsewhere in the same spell, it appears a reference to the color blue. I have come into you opposing the blue ones, that I may follow the followers of Horus. So the garments mentioned are not blue. Instead, blue is the color that the speaker attaches to his opponents. How can anyone seriously claim that this is a close parallel or even a model for the blue-robed Atlantean kings? Ellefsen then turns to the scene of reciprocal judgment that the kings perform with each other, critique, 120c, and detects a parallel to a tribunal around Osiris connected with 4 sons of Horus, p. 202. The spell 17 of the Book of the Dead informed us that this tribunal also included 3 more spirits, and together they prosecuted the enemies of Osiris. This tribunal corresponds to the brothers rendering judgment in Atlantis. Again, I see so many dissimilarities here that I cannot agree with the last sentence of the quote. The final chapter, the circular city as part of the texts juxtaposed to the Astarte papyrus, page 203-12, tries to find an Egyptian model for the peculiar circular form with its alterations of rings of water and rings of land of the Atlantean metropolis. What Ellefsen, after pages and pages of preliminaries, comes up with is this. The Astarte papyrus, written in Amenhotep II's 5th regnal year, 1420 BC, 2 years after his first campaign into Palestine and Syria, in which the king battled near the city of Kadesh, p. 206, was used as a prologue to the victories of Amenhotep II, page 205. Amenhotep's exploits were celebrated on various stelae, and passages on them inspired later celebrations of a similar campaign of Ramses II. In texts, Ellefsen calls the poem and the bulletin on page 209 and 210 respectively. These later texts inspired also pictorial reliefs, and they show the things Ellefsen really wants to get to, page 210. It is striking to find that the reliefs represented Kadesh as a fortress town over a hill, surrounded by 2 concentric water channels. It is likely that the channels were dug in preparation to Ramses II's campaigns, and they were not yet built during the earlier campaigns of Amenhotep II. And now Ellefsen thinks that he can prove that this depiction of the fortress of Kadesh represents the model for the circular metropolis of Atlantis, described by Plato's Critias, page 212. If it is correct that the poem accompanied the Astarte papyrus, it is conceivable that the scribe intended to draw a parallelism between Yam's abode in the fringes of the earth and the pharaoh's victories over Kadesh. Plato pointed out that the Egyptian priests alluded to commentaries and other external evidence to support the narrative communicated orally to Solon. Hence, it could be possible that the Egyptian priests made references to the numerous representations of the Battle of Kadesh, depicted in the walls of many Egyptian temples. These texts, commentaries, or references to Kadesh may have helped Solon to supplement the model of a circular city. This image could have complemented the map of the field of reeds and Hetep found in spell 110 of the Book of the Dead. In this most elaborate construction, Ellefsen has really outdone himself. Alas, again, a number of deficiencies have to be pointed out. Ellefsen's very first assumption is marred by a chronological impossibility. If the Astarte papyrus celebrated the exploits of Amenhotep II, late 15th century BCE, and the poem those of Ramses II, 13th century BCE, how could the later poem have accompanied the earlier Astarte papyrus? Secondly, also Ellefsen's claim that Plato pointed out that the Egyptian priests alluded to commentaries and other external evidence to support the narrative communicated orally to Solon is not quite correct. According to Plato's Critias, the priest talking to Solon said, Timis 23rd to 24th A, "We will cover the exact details of everything another time in leisure, consulting the writings themselves. There is no allusion to commentaries and other external evidence here." And thirdly, according to Plato's Critias, the Egyptian priest did not talk about Kadesh or some pharaoh's exploits in Syria, but about the greatest victory once achieved by early Athenians. All this flies squarely in the face of every attempt to substitute another Egyptian or Ugaritic storyline for this. In his short conclusion, page 213-5, Ellefsen is quite adamant. Page 213 says his, "Now we can anchor the Atlantis story and establish its provenance. Plato did not fabricate it. Plato has left us with a long trail of scattered evidence showing that he had access to a collection of Egyptian texts brought by Solon. We can trace the origin of the Atlantis account in the Astarte papyrus, telling the story of the foundation of 2 rival palaces. It was a story about the god's kingship and the rivalry between the storm god Seth-Baal and the sea deity Yam. Nowhere do we read in the Timaeus and Critias that Solon brought a collection of Egyptian texts. And it is still a mystery to me why the original story reconstructed by Ellefsen about the god's kingship and the rivalry between the storm god Seth-Baal and the sea deity Yam should have had such an appeal for Solon. When we compare this storyline to what we read in the Timaeus and Critias, we have to admit that a lot of fabrication is involved here. But fabrication by whom? If we ask Ellefsen, he does not credit Plato with much imaginative power. Page 214. Plato stopped where he had to develop the story based on the succinct information left by Solon. Hence, Solon's preparatory draft and his list of the Atlantean kings might have corresponded to Plato's introductory chapters found in the Timaeus and the Critias. Looking, however, at the evidence for Plato's imaginative power in his other dialogues, one can only conclude that Ellefsen's judgment is mostly wrong. He never even once faces the question of whether the story of Solon's encounter with the Egyptian priests can really be trusted. Solon was one of the most revered figures in the memory of the Athenians. Can we really believe that? Absolutely no one, except apparently the speaker Critias in those two dialogues of Plato. In the 2 centuries between Solon's death and Plato's writing down, Timaeus and Critias knew anything about the amazing story of the Athenian victory over Atlantis that Solon allegedly had brought with him from Egypt and allegedly intended to celebrate in a great epic poem. How can we explain such a conspiracy of silence, unless this is a reimagining by Plato of Homer's Trojan War? Turning one last time to Ellefsen's book, it would surely have profited from more diligent proofreading, preferably by a native speaker of English, who might, e.g., have eliminated the not infrequent Hispanisms in it. In the following paragraphs, I note some specific mistakes. On page 7, Ellefsen claims that Plato's view on the priority of the Athenian constitution over the Egyptian was helped by a discovery made by Eudoxus of Cnidus. Eudoxus cleverly conjured that in the earliest periods of the Egyptian history, the word for year referred to what the Greeks called month. This interpretation significantly reduced the early Egyptian chronology. With Eudoxus's novel theory as background, Plato wondered if he could prove that the institutions of the Athenian constitution were indeed the eldest. There is much speculation in these sentences. It is actually quite unclear what Eudoxus's relations with Plato and his academy were. Eudoxus seems indeed to have stated that the Egyptians called the month year, refers to 302 laser, physin Eudoxos, oti Aegypti ton mena en yafton ekalun, but there is no indication in Plato's texts that Plato ever used this information. The time frame Plato has chosen for situating the Atlantis story is fully consistent with the time frame Herodotus 2.142 had provided for the history of Egypt. Within these more than 11,000 years, both Atlantis' early existence and Egyptian records of that existence could easily be fitted in, assuming the original translation are correct and are not just an echoing of the Hittite-Trojan Wars. Ellefsen's knowledge of ancient Greek leaves something to be desired as well. On page 14, he claims that Geneon Pseudos literally means a lie about origin. I would very much like to see a reliable reference for that. On page 41, Ellefsen misrepresents what Herodotus, 2.143, reports about the genealogy that Herodotus's predecessor, Hecataeus, had claimed for himself. Hecataeus claimed that following the traditional Greek genealogies, his 16th forefather would have been a god, but Hecataeus introduced no such caveat following the traditional Greek genealogies. According to Herodotus, he in fact claimed that his 16th ancestor had been a god. On page 58, the divine papyrus must be corrected to Derveni papyrus. On page 88s, Ellefsen gets some facts of Greek mythology quite wrong. Cerberus is not both the guardian of the underworld and Geryon's cattle, for the latter is guarded by Cerberus's brother Orthos, see Hesiod Theogony 309-11, and the 10th labor of Heracles does not comprise the 2 fights against the dragon of the Hesperides and against Geryon, but just the one against Geryon, while his expedition to the Hesperides is counted as the 11th labor. On page 108, Ellefsen surmises that the Hecatoncheir Briareus Aigaion was regarded by Homer as a son of Poseidon, but there is nothing in the Homeric text, Ilgir 1.403-6, to suggest this. On page 110, Ellefsen misinterprets a passage from Plato's Laws, 4.713 CD, by explaining cities with the Isles of the Blessed, but there is no reason why we should identify these very different things with each other. On page 126, Ellefsen mistakenly identifies the Titan Menoetios, brother of Atlas and Prometheus, with Menoetes, the guardian of the cattle, not sheep, of Hades. For him, see Apollodorus. Bible 2.108 equals 2.5 times 10 times 6, and 2.125 equals 2.5 times 10 times 6, 2.5.12.7. On page 137, Ellefsen claims that this use of the word amphiris is evidenced in Pindar. But in the connected footnote, N 438 on page 256, he only quotes a verse from Euripides, Cyclops 15. In fact, Amphiris is nowhere attested in Pindar, so what went wrong here? On page 148s, Ellefsen mentions a legendary king Eurypylus as son of Poseidon and the nymph Selene, and he was one of the mythical kings of Thebes that later reigned as king of the Isles of the Blessed. As source he cites Apollodorus, Bible 3.10.1, where, however, no kings of Thebes are mentioned, and the only son of Poseidon to make it to the Isles of the Blessed is Lycus. On page 149, a very dubious ancient explanation of the adjective aimon, found e.g. in Homersil 5.49 aimonatheris, is quoted as being derived from daimon equals daimon equals skillful. This is linguistically totally unsound, but Ellefsen goes a step further and connects the word with daimones. According to Plato, the daimones were dead heroes or semi-divine beings, ancient folk who were earthborn and not begotten of one another, who ruled in the Isles of the Blessed, Laws 4.713c to d, Statesman 269b. Unfortunately, Ellefsen combines two Platonic passages here that have nothing to do with each other and so totally misunderstands them. Neither in the Laws passage nor in the Statesman passage do we find any mention of the Isles of the Blessed, and the quote from the Statesman passage, ancient folk, not begotten of one another, is no description of daimones, who are not even mentioned here. On page 155, as well as on page 157, Ellefsen calls Euenor, the father of Cleito and grandfather of the first 10 Atlantean kings, the first king of Atlantis. But in Criti 113d, the only passage where Euenor appears, he is neither styled a king nor of Atlantis, because the island got that name only from his eldest grandson, Atlas, Crete. 114a on page 246, in N 323, Ellefsen reports a passage from Plato's Symposium 189d rather incorrectly. Plato distinguished two goddesses with the name Dione. One was the daughter of Zeus, the Aphrodite Pandemos, and the other was the daughter of Uranus, the Aphrodite Urania. Actually, Dione is only the name of the mother of Aphrodite Pandemos, while the other, Urania, has no mother, and none of the two is called Dione herself. If there is one thing that Ellefsen is to be credited for, it is his tenacity. No one else, at least in more recent times, has put so much effort into finding an Egyptian source for the Atlantis story. Ironically for him, if there is any basis for it, Egypt would be his Atlantis. If not, all this effort has not yielded really convincing results, as I hope to have shown. This would prove, ex negativo, at least one important thing. There really is no basis for believing that Plato relied on real, existing sources from Egypt if Egypt is his political allegory for Atlantis when he set out to write, but ultimately leave unfinished if not a dramatically concluded the Atlantis story.